Hello everyone, welcome to another lecture for English 102. Today we're going to be talking about rhetoric. We're going to be doing a broad overview and introduction, talking about the history of rhetoric, some classical rhetorical terms, and basically getting everyone on the same page discussing rhetoric before we get into some of the fun stuff towards the back half of the course. It's important that everyone takes notes and pays attention to these first introductory lectures because this is going to lay the groundwork for how we talk about the readings, how we discuss the rhetoric used to persuade throughout the rest of the semester, as well as the particular strategies that will be employed in your essays, your persuasive essays, and the final research project, as well as particular tools you can employ when talking about course readings. So I put together a slide deck, a PowerPoint to talk through the basic introduction to rhetoric. I'm not entirely sure how long we'll go today in class. We made it about halfway through what I had prepared. So I'm going to go about up until where we talked in class, and I'll cut it off there. But there'll be another one of these videos talking about the second part of our introduction to rhetoric. So I'm going to go ahead and minimize myself. I apologize to anyone viewing this online. I got a new camera, and the high quality is making me look particularly jaundiced today. The lighting in my apartment is quite poor, as you can tell. So I'm going to go ahead and minimize myself so I don't have to look at it. This should be okay right here. And let's just jump into the PowerPoint. So, Introduction to Rhetoric Part 1 for English 102. Our first slide, what we did in class was watch a fairly humorous, short 3 to 4 minute video that Monty Python has. It's a sketch about arguments. They go round and round about the difference between a refutation and an argument. How does contradiction play into arguments? I'm not going to show it here on this video, but I will provide a link to it in the description, as well as a little flashing link that should be on the YouTube page. So please check that out. That was just kind of a humorous introduction to rhetoric and what we'll be talking about throughout the semester. Have a laugh and try to pay attention particularly to how they define argument in that video. So, what is rhetoric? You should have a decent overview of some of the rhetorical definitions based on the reading you did for the SDSU definitions that we read for Thursday. In that link, you saw rhetoric dating all the way back to the ancient Greeks and its subsequent development through Cicero up until the 19th century with Nietzsche and into the 20th century, right? So based on that overview, you got to see rhetoric and its definition evolve and develop over time. And while that is certainly true, and while that is a topic we'll be exploring throughout the remainder of the semester, I wanted to stop here and flag a definition provided by the Oxford English Dictionary on rhetoric so that we have at least some grounding material to work with. At least one definition we can come back to when we discuss the particulars of rhetoric and how various theories deviate from this place. So, as you see on the screen here, the Oxford English Dictionary, the link is provided here. This is an open source dictionary available to U of L students through the library database page. I highly recommend you check it out, particularly if you're interested in the etymology of these words. You can see where they developed from. Additionally, you can see extant examples in literature of rhetoric being used. The OED cites examples in Chaucer, dating rhetoric back all the way to early uses of English. So it might be fun for you to check that out. But let's go over this definition together and see if there's any fascinating features that jump out. So we'll take it in parts. The first part is the art of using language effectively so as to persuade or influence others, especially the exploitation of figures of speech and other compositional techniques to this end. All right. Now in class, I asked if anyone found some of this language particularly interesting or surprising. And I got some great responses. One that jumped off and provided some lengthy discussion was this term art, the art of using language effectively as to persuade. We might not initially think of rhetoric as one of the arts, right? Painting, poetry, music. These are the arts that come to mind when we think of artistic expression. But to the ancient Greeks and to many other rhetoricians, art is a aptly descriptor for what rhetoric is. It's an inventive and creative process by using language to persuade and to convince someone of one's own propositions. So art is retained here in the rhetorical definition, and it dates back all the way to Aristotle, whose book, The Art of Rhetoric, gives us the formal terminology for discussing classical rhetoric. Furthermore, students highlighted these two component features, compositional techniques, as well as figures of speech. Both of these we'll be talking about at length, but I want to quickly gloss what each of those means. So a figure of speech is a rhetorical flourish utilized by the rhetorician or the writer in means of persuading their audience or their reader. You may be familiar with some particular figures of speech. A simile is an example that might be well known, right? Comparing something using like or as. He ran around the track like a cheetah. Okay. Obviously, the person's not a cheetah. You're using a comparison. That word like carries a lot of meaning there. He runs like a cheetah. Someone knows how fast a cheetah is, they're able to piece together the logic of that sentence, right? A metaphor takes that one step further and says, he's a cheetah around the track. There's no comparison there, but we know that the runner is not actually a cheetah. We're using that to add emphasis to our statement, right? Furthermore, and related to that example is hyperbole, right? Over-exaggeration to provide extra emphasis on a particular statement. He's not actually a cheetah. He might not run as fast as a cheetah. You're over-exaggerating to provide emphasis to the point you're trying to make. These are all tools that are used when persuading an audience or a reader, and they're going to come up frequently throughout our readings, and I want you to flag those as we go, as well as learn how to incorporate them into your own writing and speaking. Figures of speech, we'll look at several of them. Understatement can be a powerful tool when you understate a particular scenario. Irony, you might be familiar with, particularly in the 21st century, where memes and satire all contain this like meta-ironic quality. Are you in on the joke? Are you outside of the joke? How is it kind of meta construction that proves the point that the viewer is supposed to attach themselves to, right? A lot of these you might be familiar with, and we'll be looking at those throughout the course. Repetition is another one that gets particular emphasis in speeches. If we think back to MLK's "I have a dream" speech, that phrase "I have a dream" is repeated frequently and with great effect. Okay. Compositional techniques are the way that the argument is actually constructed. How do we compose our language to sequence logic, to disprove the opponent's propositions, or to propagate our own conclusions based on the data at hand, right? We'll be looking at this particularly when it applies to ancient rhetoric and the term arrangement, which is one of the key terms that I'll be discussing in today's lecture. So moving on. The study of principles and rules to be followed by a speaker or writer striving for eloquence, especially as formulated by ancient Greek and Roman writers. So rhetoric is also a study. Why are we actually studying this thing that has been called rhetoric? Okay, there are principles, there are rules that have been discussed throughout history that provide insight and glean the knowledge needed to effectively persuade and influence. What are those techniques? What are those rules? I also stopped here to ask the class what eloquence meant. If that's a term that is unfamiliar to you, you can think of that as kind of sophisticated articulation, right? Instead of just saying a point, you're saying it with style. You're being over communicative, not in a negative way, but in a expansive and dense and rich way, right? You are articulating in a fashion, right? A particular flavor and style that is suited and works for the audience that is at hand, right? An eloquent speaker is one that is able to leverage a vast body of knowledge to convince their audience of a particular point. So, transitioning here, rhetoric, these rules were studied and analyzed and codified by the ancient Greek and Roman writers. And we'll look here briefly at some rhetorical origins. Okay. So, while we could teach an entire class on the history of rhetoric, and while such classes exist, that's not the scope or purpose of what we're going to be talking about in English 102. Understanding the origin point of rhetoric, I think, is important and will help us gain some foothold in the broader rhetorical conversation. But getting this grand perspective of rhetoric is not vital to our own employment of these strategies and techniques. However, starting at the origin point will give us a foundation to see how rhetoric has evolved, as well as start off with the grounding principles of rhetorical terms and usages. So, rhetoric has its formal origin and its formal beginning with the ancient Greek philosophers. So, a philosopher is someone who's asking these big questions about life, right? They might be studying what it means to live virtuously. So, they're studying the ethics of a situation, right? Do you lie? Do you lie in certain situations? Do you murder? Is it okay to kill if you're trying to save others, right? These are philosophical questions. They might be asking what it means to be. A popular question that arose during the ancient Greek time was, what does it mean to be a human being? Okay, is a human being definable by certain physical characteristics and parameters, and how would one do that? Okay. Additionally, philosophers can ask, how do we know what we know, right? Is it always granted that we can establish a common shared body of knowledge and a way of developing that knowledge? Maybe not so easily. So that's the study of epistemology, right? Rhetoric is bootstrapped to all of these big questions, metaphysical questions, questions that contemplate the abstract fundamental reality of the world, ethical questions, right? These frequently occur in the Platonic dialogues. When we think of Plato, who would we associate with that, right? Socrates comes to mind as the person most often linked with Plato. Socrates himself was not one writing down his own dialogues. Plato is the one that gives us these texts, and they're rather slim volumes. I can turn here and pull out a copy here, right? So Plato's dialogues of Euthyphro, the Apology, and Crito. These here serve as critical insight into the philosophical dialogues of his master, Socrates, who would go around ancient Mesopotamia asking people questions and would use rhetorical strategies to get the answers that he wanted, to seek out these fundamental questions. Personification is often used, comparing certain things that have non-human qualities to human qualities, okay? Using metaphor, talking about the horns of an animal, comparing it to an ethical dilemma, right? In Euthyphro's dilemma. So that's where rhetoric starts to find its formalization, is in the practice of philosophy. And this isn't really codified until Aristotle formalized the study of rhetoric with his Art of Rhetoric in the 4th century BCE. Now, Aristotle develops out of the Socratic field of ancient Greek philosophy and starts beginning to ask practical questions, okay? How does one, study rhetoric. Okay, rhetoric is not just important for these big philosophical questions, but rhetoric can also be employed to convince your parents to have tacos instead of pizza for dinner. Okay, they can convince your roommates to go see the new Spider-Man movie instead of some other movie, or stay at home and play a board game. Rhetoric is a tool, and it can be leveraged at different levels of intensity, right? For these big questions, and then for the practical questions of life. I'm going to move myself here just for a moment, so you can see this final quote from Aristotle, which should be familiar to you from the reading. But Aristotle formalizes rhetoric in his book as the faculty of discovering the possible means of persuasion in reference to any subject, whatever, right? Any subject. That is quite the statement. And I want you to think back to syllabus day when I said you don't have to agree with every writer that we read. You don't have to agree with everything that I say. Part of being a scholar at the university level is disagreeing and thinking critically about the material and coming to your own conclusions. So as you're listening to this lecture, and it's a question I posed in class, you might start thinking about subjects where Aristotle might not be entirely correct. Does rhetoric provide the faculty of discovering persuasion when it comes to mathematical truths, right? Can a good rhetorician convince someone that 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4, right? There's different schools of thought on this topic. I'm not here to tell you which one is correct, but I want to provide you the information so you can come up with your own decision here. There might be subjects where rhetoric is inappropriate for finding the solution. The scientific method, we have to understand, is not at play when Aristotle's writing, or when Socrates is doing his dialogues in the symposium, or Plato is recalling his master, right? The scientific method comes to us much later, closer to the 16th and 15th century in continental Europe, and really starts developing in the 17th and 18th century in Europe and elsewhere. So the scientific method, as you all know, is an empirical process in which hypotheses are proposed, tested, and then peer-reviewed, and so on. This acquisition of knowledge and this epistemology was not accessible to the ancient Greeks. They didn't conceive of things in a linear, empirically based scientific model as we might do today. So to them, rhetoric makes a lot of sense for applying to a variety of subjects. But it's a question to ponder yourselves as we continue through the course. So you might have seen this before. This is the Rhetorical Triangle. It's quite famous for its simplicity in explaining rhetorical relationships. We have 3 main pillars of the triangle. We have the audience, the persona, and the subject. We'll get into these particular terms throughout the course, and I want to highlight them briefly here. Persona gets its own slide because it's kind of a complicated notion. But they're interlinked, right, by purpose and tone particularly. You have your audience, which is the person that is receiving the argument, whether that is the reader of your essay, whether that's the physical audience to your speech. You have your subject, which is the topic up for discussion, and you have your persona. Sometimes, if you've seen this triangle elsewhere, the persona might say speaker, it might say self, but I think retaining it as persona is an important distinction that I'm making here. So these things are linked. The purpose needs to be clearly communicated and established between the audience and the persona. The audience needs to understand what the person that is giving the argument is trying to accomplish, and the person that is giving the argument needs to clearly communicate that purpose back to the audience in a reciprocal form. Similarly, tone needs to be matched between the subject matter and the person that's giving the argument. If you have a humorous and witty and clever tone, and the subject is something that is deathly serious, right? Euthanasia, perhaps. The tone might be misaligned with the subject, okay? And that can break down the communication of your rhetoric. So we need to make sure we have an appropriate tone situated to the subject at hand. Okay. So moving on, I want to talk about persona here. So persona is, in the Greek conception, quite literally the mask of the speaker. Now we hear the mask and we might have some negative connotations with what that means. You don't want to have a mask. You don't want to walk around with a mask. That might seem like you're fake. It might seem like you're hiding something. But in reality, we are all putting on a performance. We're always having a persona when we engage in communication. When I'm speaking here on a webcam to my class, I have a particular persona. You know, believe it or not, I don't always talk like this. I talk in a very different manner to my friends. I talk in a very different manner to my family, to my colleagues, right? I engender my speech with different intonations, with different choices of vocabulary based on the environment that I'm in, because I have a different communicative purpose with each audience, okay? You all do the same thing, right? If you want to tell someone about your favorite TV show, that's going to look very different if you tweet about it versus texting a friend, versus telling your grandma, versus writing an email to your professor, versus writing a thesis statement for a paper, right? Each context, each rhetorical situation requires a different persona, and that's okay. But recognizing that on the front end is an important step in being able to effectively persuade and effectively communicate. So the persona reflects the relationship to the subject and the audience. What are you actually talking about? And who is the audience that you're trying to communicate to? So it might be worthwhile when you're taking notes to think of some situations where you shift or alter your communication based on the topic or based on the person that you are communicating with. So I also want to highlight here, and I think this is an important point that we'll be discussing and coming back to throughout the course, that the persona, right, not the actual person, but the perception of that person and the person's own perception is complicated by identity, right? Some of the immutable characteristics that make the person who they are, whether that's the individual's race, their ethnicity, their nationality, their class, their gender, their sexual orientation, their status as neurodivergent, right? Each one of these factors plays an important part in the perception of the audience and the individual's rhetoric. I'll link to a few studies in the lecture notes that I find particularly helpful in unpacking this topic. But, in a society where we have a homogeneous understanding of language and communication, those that are marginalized and on the outside of the particular power structures can find a difficult time in persuasion when engaged in an audience whose view of the persona that the person is embodying is prejudicial. Okay, there's a particular term that we study in linguistics called linguistic profiling, right? Listening to someone's way of speaking and communicating, and looking at who the actual person is can drastically affect the way in which we view their communication. A particular study that has stayed with me for a long time now, and one that I think we should all work to understand and to as kind of a guidepost for our own interactions with rhetoric, tells us that audience participants listening to a professor's lecture, right? They have their headphones on, they're listening to a lecture, and it's a white male professor. They give them very high marks on effective communication. They say that they have wide vocabulary usage. They talk about how they can clearly, understand the message that's being communicated, right? And you switch out who the person is. Instead of a white male professor, let's say we have a black professor, okay, in place of the white professor, and they give the exact same lecture, word for word, quite literally the exact same word for word lecture. And the same audience is going to perceive ineffective communication, poor vocabulary usage, a misunderstanding of the message. Okay, and this cuts across several categories, not just race, but it is a version of linguistic profiling that is particularly damaging to effective communication. And it's something for us to be aware of as we think about our own positionality to the arguments that we're making, as well as the audience we're trying to talk about. Again, persona and audience are linked. They have a reciprocal relationship. No matter how you're viewing your own persona, the audience might have a totally different perspective. So if you get up there, you think you're confident, maybe you think you know all the material inside and out, and the audience looks at you and say, who is this ignorant person who is all full of themselves giving this persuasive speech, right? The persona and the audience's perception of the persona are misaligned here. And sometimes that can happen fairly and justly. Sometimes it can be completely arbitrary. Sometimes it can be based on the individual's identity. And we have to grapple with that as we learn to talk about and dissect rhetoric, both in our readings of rhetorical arguments, as well as the rhetorical arguments that we present ourselves. My goal for this course is that we become more empathetic listeners, and we don't rely upon these shortcuts for understanding arguments that have to do with prejudice and that have to do with biased ways of thinking and assessing persuasion, right? My goal is that we can look at things a little more comprehensively and take someone's argument at face value and drop off our own perhaps perception of their persona based on these arbitrary categories that can affect the perception of rhetoric. So I want to highlight that here, that the positionality of the speaker in a larger societal structure is deeply important in how we conceive of rhetoric and how we envision this term persona, right? The mask of the person is not something that they might always choose. It might be something that is thrust upon them by the individuals they're trying to persuade, whether that be their audience or their readers. Okay. So moving on. Let me minimize move myself back down here. So tone. You might have heard tone several times before in maybe your middle school or high school English classes, where your teacher asks you to find the tone or the mood of a particular poem or short story or what have you. But think of tone as the general attitude the speaker or writer has toward the audience. Are they domineering? Are they overly confident? Are they exuberant? Are they empathizing? Are they rallying? Think of the famous speech from Julius Caesar. Friends, Romans, countrymen, right? It's a rallying cry. The tone sets the stage for the rest of the persuasion. That's something to consider in your own speaking, in your own writing. Oftentimes, and to my dismay, undergraduates have a tendency to be a bit diminutive in their own tone. They might not think of themselves as fully fledged scholars. They might be worried about upsetting, people that they're arguing against. They might buy into the authority of particular critics that they're addressing or their own professors. But as students who are at a large public research institute, you are in the process of knowledge creation. That's what the university is for. It is to create knowledge and put it out into the world. So as members of that community, you have to start thinking of yourselves as scholars that have valid and thoughtful things to contribute. So I would be much more comfortable if your tone is a bit more overconfident, if you believe in what you have to say, if you say it with confidence and conviction, rather than hedging all of your own statements, because that doesn't lead to the same persuasive quality as a more diminutive tone. Okay, so paying attention to your tone in your writing and your class conversations will be quite important throughout the semester, and we'll look at this more and ways in which we navigate our tone to the subject and to the audience at hand. So, features of ancient rhetoric. Now you might be viewing the slide and being like, why do we have to know about ancient rhetoric? Isn't that 2,000, 2,100, years old? This is way, way back in the past. How applicable is it to me today? Well, rhetoric has changed quite a bit. The definition and the scholarship around rhetoric and how rhetoric is communicated effectively has evolved and developed over the course of time. But I do earnestly believe understanding these ancient rhetorical terms can be a great guidepost in how you think about your own techniques for persuasion. And I'm going to go over them step by step here because, quite honestly, if you know these and can employ them with competent effect, you'll do a great job in convincing people of the point that you're trying to make, and do a sufficient job in providing well researched and nuanced arguments. So while this is quite old in our conception, it stands the test of time. And quite honestly, these basic tenets and strategies of ancient rhetoric are valuable even today, and quite relevant to modern conversation. So you'll also note here that arrangement has a asterisk next to it because this particular step is subdivided into 6 phases, and we'll go over each one of those. But first here is invention. So invention should make you think of that original Aristotle quote that we examined, right? Rhetoric is the best possible means of finding the available means of persuasion in any given case, okay? So invention is the creative endeavor where skilled rhetoricians come up with ingenious ways of persuading their interlocutors, right? Rhetoric doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in conversation with another individual or an ideology or an idea. Rhetoric is always at the cost of another perspective, right? We're not just arguing into the void, mumbling to ourselves, but we're engaging in a broader conversation and a broader societal question, okay? So invention is the first step in ancient rhetoric, okay? It is this like creative impetus where we decide how we're going to construct our argument, how we're going to articulate it in a creative and nuanced way, right? Maybe people have been saying, calling for this thing for years and years and years, but they've never found the right tools for persuasion. The skilled rhetorician is able to harness maybe this past knowledge and package it in a newfound way to convince the audience of their point. So invention is quite an important task, and the key word here is creative. How do we think outside the box and actually present a new and compelling argument for topics that might have been talked about quite a bit in the past? What is that spark that brings actual persuasive change? Okay. Rhetorical arrangement, which we'll cover here, is again subdivided into 6 phases and 6 steps, but it's central to achieving the central's purpose. The ancient Greeks and Romans thought that arrangement was quite an important facet of rhetorical argument. And you can think of this as kind of the outline, the basic structure and organization of a speech or an essay. When you're asked to put things in sequence and order how you're going to present your ideas, you can think of that as arrangement, right? Do we tuck the thesis statement into the 7th paragraph in the 3rd sentence after we've already talked about all the facts and we've already talked about the question and we've already given our conclusion? No, the thesis, the critical turn of the argument, should come somewhere closer to the beginning of your persuasive piece, because then you can elaborate upon the topic at hand, and you can provide extra evidence, and you can offer a sufficient rebuttal to the topic, right? So where you place the components of your argument fall under this category of arrangement, right? So let me scroll up here and talk about the sequence of logic, right? How is the logic leveraged in the most effective position to convince your audience, to convince your reader. That's the primary objective of arrangement to the ancient Greeks. Now, we'll look at several examples throughout the semester where arrangement in the 21st century might have gone completely out of the window, right? Rhetoric today looks a lot different than it did when Socrates and Plato and Aristotle were talking about these terms and employing them to their own effects. Rhetoric today might look very different, but I still believe in this strategy of rhetoric, and being conscientious of your own rhetorical arrangement will show that you've thought through the sequence of your own perspective, as well as give the reader and the audience a clear outline of how you're coming to your conclusions. Okay. So it's broken down into these 6 phases: your introduction, your statement of facts, your division, your proof, your refutation, and your conclusion. Now you'll see the Latin names next to each of these. Obviously, these don't need to be memorized. My goal throughout the course is not to make you recall particular information or memorize rhetorical terms. Rather, I would be much happier if you understand what they mean, okay? If you can understand, incorporate, and ultimately utilize these principles, you'll be in great shape to having success with this course and beyond in your own rhetorical arguments. So, as I go through these, pay less attention to the particular terms, especially the Latin terms, and instead try to conceptualize, take notes, and think of scenarios in which each one of these can apply and how you would construct your own arguments based on this arrangement structure. So our introduction is where we start. All of you, I imagine, have written introductions in the past and have some familiarity of how an introduction should operate. You introduce the audience or the reader to the subject at hand, right? They need to know what we're talking about before we actually dive into the facts and to the persuasion. We compel the reader to listen by using the stakes of the argument. If you start off your essay with "the sky is falling, everyone listen before the world ends," right? The stakes have already been risen to almost their maximum, and you are compelling the reader to continue on, right? Your argument is of great importance if it has the fate of the world at stake, quite obviously. But you also can employ humor or wit to pique interest. If we think to Jonathan Swift's Modest Proposal, in which he offers a solution to poverty and to food shortages in Britain by suggesting that people eat the babies born in the city. He's already starting his essay off with a bit of humor and wit by calling it a modest proposal. Obviously, eating the children of inner city Londoners and those in England is not a modest proposal. It's actually quite a radical and quite a disturbing proposal, but he uses a rhetorical device called understatement to add to the satirical advantage of his piece. So humor and wit can also be effective tools here. There's a really fun English composition and rhetoric book at U of L's library from, I believe, 1917, somewhere around there, that teaches rhetoric situationally. So instead of looking at kind of a broad picture of rhetoric and unpacking its terms, it teaches students how to use rhetoric in very specific situations, most of which you won't find yourselves in today, but one in particular I always find quite humorous. It goes through how to give a effective toast, right? You're at a wedding, you give a toast to the bride and groom, and it says in the instructions to giving this toast, they should often start with a humorous anecdote, a fun story that livens the crowd. And underneath that, it says, while this is common and often quite overplayed and boring, we still recommend it as the most effective way of starting a toast, right? So like even then they know that the like funny toast is kind of played out, but because it's tradition, because people expect it, starting a toast with a bit of humor was recommended back in the 1910s. So humor and wit are valid in using in useful strategies to pique the audience's interest and to get everyone into the actual argument that you're going to be making later on. Lastly, your introduction should work at establishing credibility. Ethos is what we call this. Ethos is a rhetorical appeal, which we'll be discussing at a later date. But I wanted to flag it here so when you go back, you could recognize, hey, this is what ethos means. But ethos is referencing this appeal to credibility, right? So you need to tell the audience why they should listen to you, right? If you are making an argument on why a particular policy should be adopted, well, you might need to establish yourself as an expert on that field, okay? If you have no expertise in what you're talking about, or you are an uncredible witness or individual that is trying to make an argument about a particular topic, you're going to lose credibility quite quickly with your audience, and convincing them will be that much harder. So in your introduction, establishing the credibility you have over a topic is an effective way of getting them to buy into the rest of what you have to say. Okay. Statement of facts. This is something that you should be quite aware of and should be quite familiar to you, especially those of us that grew up in the modern era where empirical data reigns supreme. Again, the statement of facts looks very different for the ancient Greeks and for the ancient Romans, where empiricism wasn't developed to the point that it is today. But the statement of facts is basically the building blocks and the material in which you form your argument, okay? So the actual background information, the factual data at hand that you're using to construct a point out of. It also sets the parameters or the goalposts of the debate, okay? Like what is actually going to be acceptable and admissible in your data. It can often outline the importance and establish the need to address a question or problem at hand, okay? The data says this, and we don't have a solution to it. Or maybe we do have a solution to it, and it doesn't work. And here's my new proposal, okay? The statement of facts is where research comes into play. That's why I've linked the 3 climate change databases for you to scour their own factual information about the climate crisis, because you'll be employing some of those statements of facts in your own writing for the course. So statement of facts, quite important, fairly straightforward, but you need to have established the groundwork before you actually get to your final argument. Division. This topic is the place in which you provide an outline to the reader of what's to come, right? So you give out the various subtopics of conversation and offer a broad overview of the argumentative sequence. This kind of conceptualize this as your roadmap, right? You don't want to just give an argument that doesn't have a roadmap for your reader or your audience to follow. You need to give them clear steps and clear subtopics that you'll be hitting on throughout the rest of the speech or the essay so that they can follow along. Providing a broad scope overview of everything gives your reader or audience the perspective needed to follow along with each individual point. So the division portion can oftentimes be overlooked, but I think it's incredibly effective as it establishes kind of the grand scope from the outset. And in doing so, allows your reader to kind of catch on and flag certain topics as they emerge throughout the rest of the paper or the speech. Okay, your proof. Now this is the most important portion of your rhetorical arrangement. So it's where the critical turn happens in many persuasive speeches or persuasive essays. It's the logical connection to the facts that we've already established, okay? It's putting things together. It's saying, well, if the facts say this, right? Let's say we're arguing about electric vehicles. If the facts say that mining for lithium batteries is exploitative and electric vehicles have a higher rate of catching fire, et cetera, then my point is we shouldn't be buying electric vehicles, right? Because it's unethical, it's exploitative to third world countries. It's also harmful to consumers because they have a greater chance of safety hazards when they're charging their lithium batteries. Okay, that's where the proof comes in, right? You got the facts on the ground, you've established them, you've talked through them, you've established the credibility and the validity of their empirical data, and then we go into the proof. Like, is this the solution? Should we actually consider this, right? The electrical car debate could go in the entirely opposite direction, right? Despite potential drawbacks of lithium mining and fire safety hazards, these don't outweigh the benefits of using electric cars to reduce emissions at a large macro scale. Okay, so your proof is the actual argument. Like, what is it that you're trying to prove here? So it shows how the conclusion that you've derived is reached. It shows the necessary work by which you derive with your prescription about the particular problem. It's the accurate diagnosis based on the facts at hand. Okay, so this is the most vital portion of any persuasive piece is the proof. Okay, should be fairly straightforward. Now we have our refutation. Many of you might have seen this as the rebuttal section of your essays in previous courses, but essentially it's the same thing. The refutation demonstrates the flaws in the opposing proposition or argument. Effective rhetoricians know the other side's point inside and out, right? You can articulate back to your opponents exactly what they're trying to say and how you know how their logic works. Okay, you know what their facts are, you know how they're driving their proofs, and you're able to articulate to your audience or your reader why they shouldn't accept those opponents' point of view. Okay. So this is a very critical portion of any persuasive piece because it can often be done ineffectively, especially in a short time frame. If you watch a lot of political debates or you read these kind of hit pieces on the internet, oftentimes the refutation is done insincerely and can create the strawman fallacy, which we'll be talking about when we go over the logical fallacies. Essentially, a strawman fallacy is a constructed argument that the person you're arguing against doesn't actually believe, but it's what it's easier to argue against, right? Does that make sense? So when you ineffectively refute their point, you're constructing a straw man, right? A fake argument, one that might resemble the person you're arguing against point of view, but is not entirely reflective of the way they sequence their logic or their facts or what have you. And you're arguing against that. You're not actually refuting the real argument at hand. You're refuting a made-up argument, right? So when we do our refutations in our final research papers and when we try to refute arguments from writers that we look throughout the course or in interpersonal dialogue, in class conversation and in our class seminars, be sure that we are actually refuting the argument at hand. Make sure that we know the other person's point of view inside and out. How does the other side think about this, right? Putting ourselves in their shoes. Like, why would they actually argue for this? How does their sequence line up to the facts that we've both agreed upon? That's why the refutation part is tricky, and we'll be walking through it and some examples throughout the semester and how to effectively refute another argument. Your conclusion, right? So the conclusion reestablishes the credibility of the persona. So going back to our appeal to ethos, we need to let the reader or the audience know again at the outset, hey, this is why you should listen to me. You know, I've done a lot of research, I've consulted experts, I have experience in this field, what have you. You need to establish this credibility again at the back half of your persuasion, according to the ancient Greeks and Romans. Also, a reminder of the stakes is important. Okay, why are we actually talking about this? Is this important on a global scale, on a national scale, on a local scale? What are the actual stakes at play here? Offer solutions to the problem, right? If, let's say, electric cars are not worthy of pursuing in your argument, you've demonstrated based on the facts that they pose more harm than good. Well, cool. That's great. What's the actual solution to that? Emissions are still rising. Non-electric vehicles pose significant environmental risks. That's why the need for electric vehicles has arisen. Is there a potential solution there? Do we need to have more hybrid cars, more hybrid investment? Do we need to cap MPGs at a certain level, right? Can manufacturers only produce cars at a certain MPG threshold? Do we need to tax certain vehicles based on their emission rates at a higher threshold in order to combat the problem? So if you diagnose a problem correctly, well, great. What's the solution? Okay, offering that solution to your reader, to your audience, will go a long way in establishing the validity of your argument and why it should be taken seriously, because you've thought through to the end. You haven't thought through just the diagnosis. You're not just a good critic, you're also good at persuading people to take action, right? And then lastly, recognizing the limitations in your own argument, okay? This is something that very rarely happens in political discourse and contemporary discourse around heated issues. But it's something I'm going to preach over and over again throughout our semester together, is showing where you might not know everything. Okay, this is a good way of continuing your own credibility and showing that there are places and gaps in our own knowledge that we can't always account for, right? Where are places where you wish you had more data? Where are places wish you had more experience? Showing your own limitations doesn't discredit your own argument. It actually makes it stronger. When you make 10 broad generalizations and claims and arguments, and one of them is spot on, but all the 9 others are completely outside the scope, and you have significant limitations that keep people from believing that they're true, well, no one's going to believe the last argument, right? If you stick to one particular argument and point and recognize that there are limitations to your own logic and to your own knowledge for these other 9 arguments, well, then you've reaffirmed your credibility and you've made your argument that much stronger. So I'm going to stop here. We have quite a bit left to cover. We haven't even talked about the logical appeals yet, but we're going to do that either in class or in one of these supplemental video lectures. But if you're viewing online because you weren't in class on Thursday, I appreciate you checking in on this feed. It'll prove very beneficial as we go through the rest of the course, and you're caught up with everyone else. This is about as far as I went with both of my sections, so you should be all caught up there. If you have any questions at all, please don't hesitate in emailing me and asking for further clarifications. Again, these first introductory lectures are quite important in my view because they are the shared language and framework in which we analyze the rest of the semester's readings. So I want to make sure everyone's on the same page here, and if you have questions, I'd much rather you ask because you might not be the only person that has a question. Oftentimes, if you have a question, others have questions and they haven't asked them yet. So if you have questions, send them my way. If not, make sure you are caught up with the reading responses and homework for Tuesday. And those of you that are quarantining beyond then, you'll see another lecture posted for next Tuesday. So, all right, everyone take care. I appreciate it.